Grace Johnson had almost nothing: a broken cabin, an empty pantry, and $11 to her name. But when two freezing 6-year-olds knocked on her door during the worst blizzard in Montana history, she gave them everything she had. She didn't know they were billionaire Richard Moretti's missing sons. She didn't know that 50 Royces would arrive at dawn. She only knew one thing: when children need help, you open the door. This is the story of how love broke through the coldest night and changed everything. Before we begin, I need your help with something. My mom told me I'll never reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel. So if you believe in stories of hope and kindness like the one you're about to hear, please hit that like button and subscribe to prove her wrong. Also, I'm so curious, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. Alright, now let's travel back to that frozen Montana night where everything changed. The clock above Grace Johnson's broken stove read 2:14 a.m. when she finally let herself sit down. Her hands, rough from years of diner work and splitting firewood, trembled as she counted the crumpled bills scattered across the splintered kitchen table. $11. That was all that stood between her 6-year-old daughter Maya and another morning without breakfast. Grace pressed her calloused palms against her tired eyes, feeling exhaustion sink into her bones like the Montana cold that crept through every crack in the cabin walls. At 27, Grace looked closer to 35. Her dark skin, once radiant and smooth, had dulled under the relentless pressure of survival. The circles under her eyes were permanent now, carved deep by too many sleepless nights and too many impossible choices. Her hair, pulled back in a practical bun, showed strands of premature gray at the temples, badges of a grief she carried but never spoke about. The wooden cabin creaked around her, groaning under the weight of another brutal winter. Maya slept peacefully on the old couch. Wrapped in every blanket, Grace owned a patchwork quilt her mother had made, a faded pink throw from the thrift store, and Daniel's old work jacket that still smelled faintly of sawdust and Old Spice. Daniel. Grace's throat tightened. 2 years had passed since the construction accident that took her husband, but the wound felt as fresh as yesterday. His insurance had paid for the funeral and exactly 3 months of rent in their old apartment in town. When that money ran out, she'd found this cabin, if you could call it that, more like a weathered shack at the edge of the forest, miles from the nearest neighbor, forgotten by everyone except the bank that was happy to rent it cheap. The isolation was the hardest part. The nearest town, Silver Ridge, was 10 miles away down a winding dirt road that became impassable in heavy snow. The few families who lived closer had made it clear that a young black single mother wasn't welcome in their small, insular community. Grace had learned to recognize the look, the way their eyes would pass over her as if she were invisible, or worse, as if she were something dangerous. Her phone buzzed against the table, the sound jarring in the pre-dawn silence. Grace's heart sank as she read the text message glowing on the cracked screen. Grace, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to let you go. Business has been slow, and we need to cut hours. We'll mail your last check. Frank, the diner, her only source of income, gone with a text message at 2 a.m. Grace stared at the words until they blurred. That was it, then. No job, no savings, no family to call for help. Her mother had passed 3 years ago, taking with her the only person who had ever truly understood Grace's struggle. Her father had never been in the picture, and Daniel's family had cut her off after the funeral, making it clear they blamed her for their son's death, as if loving him had somehow caused the scaffolding to collapse. She walked to the window and stared out at the dark forest. Snow was beginning to fall again, soft flakes drifting down like cold confessions. The weather report had been warning about it for days, the worst blizzard to hit Montana in 20 years. She had stocked up on what little she could afford: dried beans, rice, a few cans of soup, some powdered milk for Maya. Behind her, Maya stirred and coughed a wet, rattling sound that made Grace's chest tighten with worry. The cabin was cold, too cold, despite the fire she'd been nursing all night. She walked over and pressed her hand against her daughter's forehead. Warm, but not feverish. Not yet. It's okay, baby girl, Grace whispered, tucking the blankets tighter around Maya's small body. Mama's here. Mama's always here. But even as she said it, the doubt crept in. How much longer could she keep that promise? Grace's mother's voice echoed in her memory, clear as church bells on Sunday morning. Grace, baby. When you don't know what else to do, you remember this. The good Lord never shuts one door without opening another. You just got to have faith enough to keep walking toward that next door, even when you can't see it yet. And when someone comes knocking on your door in need, you open it. You open it because kindness is never wasted. What you give comes back, child. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it comes back. I'm trying, Mama. Grace whispered to the empty room. "I'm trying so hard." The wind picked up outside, howling through the pine trees like a wounded animal. Grace added the last piece of firewood to the stove, knowing it would only last a few more hours. She'd have to go out in the morning and split more, assuming the snow didn't make that impossible. She sat back down at the table and pulled out a worn notebook, her dream journal, though the name felt foolish now. Inside were sketches and plans for a small catering business she'd wanted to start. Her mother had taught her to cook soul food that made people close their eyes and sigh with satisfaction. Grace had even catered a few church events before Daniel died, earning enough praise that she'd dared to dream bigger. But dreams didn't pay for electricity. Dreams didn't fix broken heaters or buy winter coats for growing children. Grace flipped through the pages, past recipes and business plans, until she reached the last entry written 3 weeks ago in a moment of desperate optimism. "If I can just hold on until spring, maybe I can start the catering business. Maybe I can give Maya the life she deserves. Maybe kindness will come back around." The words felt like they'd been written by a different person, someone who still believed in maybes. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the cabin, making the windows rattle. The candle on the table flickered and nearly went out. Grace cupped her hand around the flame, protecting it, and thought about how fragile everything had become: her hope, her future, even the tiny fire that kept them from freezing. She was about to blow out the candle and try to sleep when she heard it. At first, she thought it was the wind playing tricks, but then it came again, clearer this time, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A faint, desperate crying. A child's voice, thin and terrified, cutting through the howl of the blizzard. Grace's head snapped up. She pressed her ear against the door, holding her breath. "Please." The word was barely audible, carried on the wind like a ghost. "Please, help." Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to keep the door locked, to protect what little she had. Who would be out there in this storm? What kind of danger might be waiting on the other side of that door? But the crying came again, weaker now, fading. Grace looked back at Maya, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the choice her mother was about to make. She thought of her mother's words. "When someone comes knocking in need, you open it." Her hand moved to the deadbolt before her mind had fully decided. The metal was ice cold against her palm. She hesitated for only a moment, sending up a quick prayer: "Lord, if I'm making a mistake, please protect my baby." And then she pulled the door open. The blizzard roared into the cabin like a living thing, bringing with it a blast of snow and wind that nearly knocked her backward. Grace shielded her eyes, squinting into the whiteout, and saw them. 2 small boys stood on her porch, so covered in snow they looked like little ghosts. Their lips were blue, their eyes were wide with terror and exhaustion. They couldn't have been more than 6 years old, clutching each other for warmth, shaking so violently they could barely stand. Grace didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed both boys by their frozen jackets and pulled them inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. "It's okay," she said, her voice shaking with urgency and fear. "You're safe now. I've got you." The boys collapsed onto the floor, too cold and exhausted to even cry properly. Grace's mind raced. She didn't know who they were. She didn't know where they'd come from. All she knew was that 2 children were dying of cold in her arms, and she would give everything she had to keep them alive. Grace worked through the night with trembling hands and fierce determination. She stripped the boys out of their frozen clothes, wrapped them in every dry blanket and piece of clothing she could find, and held them close to the fire. She made weak tea with honey and warmed their hands and feet with gentle pressure, the way her mother had taught her to treat frostbite. As the hours passed and color slowly returned to their faces, the boys began to speak in whispers. "I'm Ethan," said one, his voice hoarse. "Oliver," said the other, gripping his brother's hand. "Where's your daddy?" Grace asked gently. "The car crashed," Ethan said, tears filling his eyes. "He told us to wait, but it was so cold." Grace's heart broke. Their father was probably out there somewhere, dead or dying in the storm, and these boys had wandered away looking for help. "You did good," she told them, pulling them closer. "You found help. You're going to be okay." Maya woke up as dawn approached, her eyes going wide at the sight of the 2 boys by the fire. "Mama, who are they?" "They're our guests, baby," Grace said softly. "They got lost in the storm, so we're going to help them, okay?" Maya nodded solemnly and without being asked. She pulled her favorite stuffed bear from her blanket pile and handed it to Ethan. "You can hold him," she said. "He keeps me warm." Grace watched her daughter's simple act of kindness and felt tears prick her eyes. Even with so little, Maya understood what mattered. As the first gray light of morning crept through the windows, Grace stood and looked at the 3 children huddled together by her dying fire. She had no idea that in just a few hours, the sound of engines would shatter the silence. She had no idea that 50 luxury cars were already searching every back road in Montana. She had no idea that the 2 little boys she'd saved were heirs to a fortune larger than she could imagine. All she knew was that she'd opened her door when someone knocked, and that simple choice was about to change everything. The first thing Grace did was get them out of their wet clothes. Her hands shook partly from adrenaline, partly from fear of what she might find as she peeled away the frozen jackets and snow-crusted pants. The boys were too exhausted to resist, their small bodies limp and compliant as she worked. Their skin was pale, almost translucent in the candlelight, with patches of angry red on their fingers and cheeks where frostbite had begun to set in. "Maya, baby, I need you to bring me all the blankets from your bed," Grace called over her shoulder, keeping her voice calm even though her heart was racing. Maya scrambled off the couch, suddenly wide awake and moving with purpose. She returned moments later, dragging her thin pink blanket and the quilt that usually covered her at night. She didn't complain about the cold or ask why. She just handed them to her mother with solemn eyes that seemed older than 6 years should allow. "Good girl," Grace whispered, taking the blankets and wrapping the boys like small mummies. "Now grab that pot from the stove careful. Use the towel and bring it here." Grace had been heating water for tea when she'd heard the crying. Now that lukewarm water became a lifeline. She dipped a clean cloth into it and gently pressed it against the boys' frozen hands, warming them slowly. Too fast and she could damage the tissue. Her mother had taught her that years ago, back when they'd found a homeless man nearly frozen outside their church. "I know it hurts," she murmured as one of the boys whimpered. "I know, baby, but we have to get you warm. Just breathe. You're safe now." Maya sat cross-legged on the floor beside them, watching with wide, worried eyes. She reached out tentatively and touched the darker-haired boy's hand. "You're really cold," she said softly. The boy looked at her but didn't speak, his eyes gray-blue. Grace noticed now were glassy with exhaustion and shock. "What are your names?" Grace asked gently, continuing to work on their hands. "Can you tell me who you are?" The lighter-haired boy spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan." His brother, they had to be brothers. The resemblance was striking despite their different coloring swallowed hard before answering. "Oliver. Ethan and Oliver," Grace repeated, committing the names to memory. "Those are strong names. I'm Grace, and this is my daughter, Maya." "Hi," Maya said, offering a shy wave. Oliver's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile, but it faded quickly. "Where's your daddy?" Grace asked, still working on their hands, moving now to their feet. "Is he out there looking for you?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "The car crashed," he said, his voice breaking. "We went off the road," Daddy said. He said to wait while he went for help, but it was so cold, and he didn't come back, and we got scared. "So we walked," Oliver finished, his voice hollow. "We saw the light from your window." Grace's chest tightened. Their father was out there somewhere in the blizzard, possibly hurt, possibly dead. These boys had been wandering through sub-zero temperatures with nothing but their winter coats. The fact that they'd survived it all was a miracle. "You did the right thing," Grace said firmly, looking both boys in the eyes. "You were so brave to find help. Your daddy would be proud of you." She didn't let herself think about what would happen if their father never came back. One crisis at a time. "Are you hungry?" Grace asked. "When's the last time you ate?" The boys looked at each other, and Oliver shrugged. "Breakfast, maybe?" "We had sandwiches in the car." That had been hours ago. Grace stood and moved to the kitchen, her mind already cataloging what little food she had. The dried beans would take too long. The rice needed more water than she could spare. But she had 2 cans of chicken noodle soup, one of them intended for Maya's lunch tomorrow, and half a loaf of bread that was getting stale. Tomorrow didn't matter if these boys didn't survive tonight. She emptied both cans into her dented pot and set it on the stove, stirring slowly as the soup heated. The smell filled the small cabin, warm and comforting. Maya appeared at her elbow, tugging on her shirt. "Mama, are they going to be okay?" Grace looked down at her daughter's worried face and forced a smile. "Yes, baby. They're going to be just fine. We're going to take care of them until their daddy finds them." "What if he doesn't?" The question hit like a punch to the gut. Grace crouched down to Maya's level. "Then we'll figure it out. But right now they need us to be strong and kind. Can you do that?" Maya nodded solemnly. 10 minutes later, Grace ladled the soup into mismatched bowls, the only dishes she owned, and brought them to the boys. They sat huddled by the fire now, wrapped in blankets with only their faces showing. They took the bowls with trembling hands, and Grace had to help them hold the spoon steady enough to eat. "Slow sips," she warned. "Your stomachs aren't ready for too much at once." The boys obeyed, sipping cautiously. Color was slowly returning to their faces, the dangerous blue tinge fading from their lips. Grace watched them with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. They weren't out of danger yet. Maya sat between them with her own small bowl, eating quietly. After a few minutes, she turned to Ethan. "Do you want to hold my bear?" she asked, offering the worn stuffed animal she'd had since birth. "He keeps nightmares away." Ethan looked at the bear, then at Maya, and nodded. He tucked the toy under his blanket, holding it close. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the windows with such force that Grace worried they might shatter. The storm was getting worse. She added another precious piece of wood to the fire, knowing she was burning through her supply faster than she could afford but unable to let the children suffer. "Miss Grace?" Oliver's voice was small, uncertain. "Yes, sweetheart. Are we going to die?" The question hung in the air, heavy and terrible. Maya's eyes went wide. Ethan started to cry silently, tears sliding down his cheeks. Grace moved to sit on the floor between them, pulling all three children close. "No," she said with absolute conviction. "No, baby. You are not going to die. I promise you that. You're safe here. But the storm will pass," Grace interrupted gently. "Storms always do, and until it passes, we're going to stay right here by this fire, and we're going to keep each other warm." The children pressed closer to her, seeking comfort. Grace wrapped her arms around all three of them, feeling Maya's familiar weight on one side and the unfamiliar fragility of the two boys on the other. "My mama used to tell me a story when I was scared," Grace said softly. "Do you want to hear it?" Three small heads nodded against her. "She said that a long, long time ago, before any of us were born, the angels looked down from heaven and saw how dark the world was at night. They saw children who were scared of the dark, and travelers who got lost because they couldn't see their way home. So the angels made a deal with God. They said, 'Let us become stars so we can light the way for the people we love.'" Grace's voice took on the rhythm her mother had used, soft and melodic, like a lullaby. And God said yes. So the angels scattered themselves across the sky, each one becoming a star. And now, whenever you're lost or scared or alone, you can look up at the stars and know that the angels are watching over you. They're lighting your way home. The children were quiet, listening. The wind screamed outside, but inside the cabin, there was only the crackle of the fire and the sound of Grace's voice. "Are the stars watching us now?" Ethan asked. "Even through the storm," Grace promised. "They can see us, and they're going to make sure you get home safe." Oliver was quiet for a long moment. Then he said in a voice thick with emotion, "You sound like Mommy used to." Grace's throat tightened. Used to. Past tense. She felt a pang of grief not just for her own loss, but for whatever loss these boys had endured. She held them tighter. "Then your mommy must have been a very wise woman," Grace said softly. "And I bet she'd be so proud of how brave you both were tonight." Ethan was crying harder now, but it was a different kind of crying, the kind that comes when you finally feel safe enough to let go. Oliver joined him, both boys releasing the terror they'd been holding inside. Grace rocked them gently, humming an old hymn her mother used to sing. Maya, sensing what was needed, snuggled closer and added her small voice to the humming. Time lost meaning. Grace didn't know if it was midnight or 3 in the morning. All she knew was that she had to keep these children alive until dawn. She stayed awake while they eventually drifted off to sleep, their breathing evening out into peaceful rhythms. The fire burned low. Grace added more wood, watching the flames catch and grow. Outside, the blizzard raged with no sign of stopping. The temperature inside the cabin hovered just above freezing, and Grace could see her breath in the air beyond the fire's immediate warmth. She thought about the boy's father out there somewhere. She thought about her own Daniel, who had left for work one morning and never come home. She thought about all the ways life could break in an instant, leaving behind nothing but questions and grief. But she also thought about her mother's words, "Kindness is never wasted." Grace looked down at the 3 sleeping children arranged around her like petals on a flower. Maya's dark curls mixed with Ethan's light blonde hair and Oliver's sandy brown. 3 children from different worlds, brought together by a storm and a mother's choice to open her door. She didn't know who these boys were or where they came from. She didn't know if their father would be found alive. She didn't know how she'd feed them beyond tomorrow. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had done the right thing. As dawn approached and the first gray light began to seep through the windows, Grace finally allowed her eyes to close. Just for a moment, she told herself. Just long enough to rest. She didn't know that in a few hours, The sound of engines would shatter the silence. She didn't know that her life was about to change forever. All she knew was that for one night, she had kept 3 children safe. And sometimes, that's enough. Grace woke with a start, her neck stiff from sleeping upright against the wall. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why her body ached so badly. Then she felt the weight against her side, 3 small bodies still huddled close, breathing softly in sleep. The memories flooded back. The storm, the knock, the 2 freezing boys. She carefully extracted herself from the tangle of children and blankets, moving slowly so as not to wake them. Her joints protested, stiff from the cold and the awkward position. Outside the window, the world had transformed. Dawn was breaking over Montana, painting the sky in shades of pale pink and gray. The blizzard had finally passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness that felt almost unnatural after the violence of the night. Snow had piled against the cabin walls in massive drifts, some reaching nearly to the bottom of the windows. The pine trees surrounding her property sagged under the weight of white, their branches bent like old men in prayer. The cabin looked like a snow-covered fortress, isolated, buried, forgotten by the world. Grace moved to the window and pressed her hand against the cold glass. The road that led to her cabin, barely visible even in good weather, had completely disappeared under the snow. She could see nothing but an unbroken expanse of white stretching in every direction. Even if she wanted to take the boys somewhere, there was no way out. Her truck hadn't started in 3 weeks, and even if it had, the snow was too deep to drive through. They were completely cut off. The fire had burned down to embers. Grace added the last 2 pieces of firewood from her dwindling pile, watching the flames reluctantly catch. She'd have to go out later and dig through the snow to reach her woodpile, assuming the storm hadn't buried it completely. Her old radio sat on the kitchen counter, its antenna bent at an odd angle from years of poor reception. Grace hadn't turned it on in days, batteries were precious, and news was usually just a reminder of a world she couldn't afford to be part of. But now she needed to know what was happening. Were the roads being cleared? Were rescue crews out looking for stranded travelers? Were they looking for 2 lost boys? She turned the dial carefully, keeping the volume low so as not to wake the children. Static crackled through the speaker, sharp and grating. She adjusted the antenna, moving it back and forth until she caught fragments of a signal. Hazardous conditions continuing throughout. Stay off the roads unless... Grace fine-tuned the dial, leaning closer. The signal strengthened slightly. National Weather Service has issued a winter storm warning for the following counties: Lewis and Clark, Flathead, Powell. She was about to change stations when the broadcaster's tone shifted, becoming more urgent. We have breaking news in the search for the missing Moretti children. Ethan and Oliver Moretti, 6-year-old twin sons of billionaire industrialist Richard Moretti, remain missing after their vehicle went off Route 49 during yesterday's blizzard. Search and rescue teams have been unable to reach the crash site due to severe weather conditions. The boy's driver, Marcus Chen, was found deceased at the scene. Authorities believe the children may have wandered from the vehicle seeking shelter. Grace's hand froze on the radio dial. Richard Moretti, CEO of Moretti Industries and one of the wealthiest men in America, has personally joined the search efforts. He is offering a $5 million reward for any information leading to the safe return of his sons. Anyone with information is urged to contact. The signal dissolved back into static, but Grace barely noticed. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The words echoed in her mind, rearranging themselves into impossible patterns. Billionaire, Moretti, $5 million. She turned slowly, her eyes finding the 2 boys sleeping peacefully by the dying fire. Ethan's blonde hair caught the morning light. Oliver's arm was wrapped protectively around Maya's stuffed bear. They looked so small, so ordinary in their borrowed blankets. But they weren't ordinary. They were the missing heirs to a fortune she couldn't even comprehend. Grace's legs suddenly felt weak. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself, her mind racing. Richard Moretti. She'd heard that name before everyone had. His company built everything from luxury hotels to industrial machinery. He owned buildings in New York, London, Dubai. He'd been on the cover of magazines, featured in documentaries about American success stories. And his children, his missing children, were sleeping in her cabin. Her heart began to pound so hard she could hear it in her ears. The driver was dead. The boys had been wandering in a blizzard while their father, one of the most powerful men in the world, searched desperately for them. And by pure chance, by a miracle she didn't understand, they had found her door. Panic hit her like a wave. She had to tell someone. She had to get word to the authorities, to the search teams, to their father. But how? Her phone had died 2 days ago, and she had no way to charge it. Even if it worked, there was no cell signal this far from town. Her truck was dead. The roads were impassable. The nearest neighbor, who wouldn't help her anyway, was 5 miles through chest-deep snow. She was trapped in her cabin with 2 children worth more than everything she'd ever owned, ever seen, ever dreamed of combined. And nobody knew they were here. Grace pressed her hands against her face, trying to slow her breathing. Think. She had to think clearly. The storm had passed. That meant rescue crews would be out soon. Searching. They'd check every cabin, every house, every structure, between Route 49 and town. Eventually, they'd make it here. She just had to keep the boys safe until then. But what if it took days? What if the snow was too deep for even rescue vehicles? What if— Mama? Grace spun around to find Maya sitting up, rubbing her eyes sleepily. The little girl looked at the 2 boys still sleeping beside her and broke into a huge smile. "The snow princes are still here," Maya whispered excitedly, careful not to wake them. "I thought maybe I dreamed them." Grace's panic threatened to choke her, but she forced it down, buried it deep where Maya wouldn't see. She crossed the room and knelt beside her daughter, smoothing down her sleep-wild curls. "Yes, baby, they're still here," Grace said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. "They'll be staying with us a little longer. Can they play with me when they wake up?" Maya's eyes shone with hope. It had been so long since she'd had anyone to play with, trapped in isolation with only her mother for company. "Maybe, if they're feeling up to it." Grace kissed her daughter's forehead. "Why don't you go wash your face while I make breakfast?" Maya nodded and padded toward the bathroom in her mismatched socks. Grace stood on shaky legs and moved to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she inventoried her meager supplies. 1 can of soup left, some rice, powdered eggs that were probably expired, not nearly enough to feed 4 people for more than a day or 2. She had saved the sons of a billionaire with the last of her food and heat. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so terrifying. Grace forced herself to move mechanically, mixing the powdered eggs with water, heating what was left of yesterday's soup. As she worked, she became aware of movement behind her. She turned to find both boys awake, sitting up in their nest of blankets. They looked better than they had last night. Color had returned to their faces, and their eyes were clearer, but they still looked small and lost and scared. "Good morning," Grace said softly, her voice not quite steady. "How are you feeling?" "Warmer," Ethan said. "Hungry," Oliver added. "Well, I'm making breakfast right now. It's not much, but— Will Daddy find us?" Ethan interrupted, his voice cracking with desperate hope. "Is he looking?" The question pierced Grace's heart. She looked at these 2 boys, these 2 heirs who had no idea that their father was tearing apart the state looking for them, who didn't know that hundreds of people were searching, who didn't know that their mother was already gone and their driver was dead and they were the most precious lost things in all of Montana. Grace swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. "He's looking right now," she said, and it wasn't a lie. "I promise you, sweetheart, your daddy is looking for you, and he won't stop until he finds you." "But what if he can't?" Oliver's voice was small, frightened. "What if we're lost forever?" Grace crossed the room and knelt before them, taking both their cold hands in hers. "You're not lost," she said firmly. "You're found. You found me, and I'm going to keep you safe until your daddy gets here. Do you understand? You are not alone." The boys nodded, though tears shimmered in their eyes. Behind them, through the window, the morning sun climbed higher, turning the snow into fields of blinding white. Somewhere out there, Grace knew, a desperate father was searching. Somewhere, helicopters and search teams and resources beyond her imagination were being mobilized. And here, in a forgotten cabin at the edge of nowhere, his sons were eating powdered eggs made by a woman with $11 to her name. Grace served breakfast on chipped plates, watching the children eat. Maya chattered happily, excited to have friends. The boys ate quietly, their manners impeccable despite their hunger, trained to be polite even in crisis. Rich kids, Grace thought. They've probably never eaten powdered eggs in their lives. But they ate every bite and said thank you. As Grace watched them, a strange feeling settled over her, something between fear and purpose. She didn't know what would happen when Richard Moretti finally arrived. She didn't know if she'd be rewarded or blamed or simply dismissed. She didn't know anything except this. For now, these boys needed her, and she wouldn't fail them. Outside, in the distance, she thought she heard something. An engine maybe, or just the wind playing tricks. She moved to the window and stared out at the endless white, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Not yet. The morning stretched on in uneasy quiet. Grace kept the children occupied as best she could, though her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't silence. Maya had convinced the boys to play a game with her stuffed animals, arranging them in a circle on the floor like a makeshift tea party. Their soft voices and occasional laughter created a fragile bubble of normalcy that Grace desperately tried to maintain. She stood at the sink, washing the breakfast dishes with melted snow water, when she heard it. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a trick of the mind playing games after a sleepless night. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. A low rumble, mechanical and deliberate, cutting through the crystalline silence of the snow-covered forest. Engines. Multiple engines. Grace's hands stilled in the dishwater. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs as the rumble grew into a steady roar. The children stopped playing, their heads turning toward the sound. "What's that?" Maya asked, her voice small and uncertain. Grace dried her hands on a threadbare towel and moved to the window. At first, she could see nothing but the blinding white of snow and morning sun. Then, in the distance, where the old dirt road should be, she saw movement. "Stay here," she told the children, her voice coming out sharper than she intended. "All of you, stay inside." She grabbed Daniel's old work coat from the hook by the door and stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind her. The cold hit her like a physical force, stealing her breath, but she barely noticed. Her attention was fixed on what was coming down the road. It couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a fever dream brought on by exhaustion and stress. But it was real. Down the snow-covered path that led to her forgotten cabin, a procession was approaching. Not trucks, not rescue vehicles, not the county's ancient snowplows. Royces, black Royces, gleaming like obsidian against the white landscape, moving in perfect formation. One after another, cutting through snow that should have been impassable, crawling forward with mechanical precision. Grace's mind couldn't process the number. 10, 20, 30, more. They kept coming, a river of luxury and wealth flowing toward her tiny, broken-down cabin like something from a dream or a nightmare. She gripped the porch railing, her knuckles white. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen to people like her, in places like this. The lead vehicle stopped about 50 yards from her cabin, and the others fell into formation behind it, creating a semicircle that surrounded her property. The engines idled, their collective purr a sound of power and money that seemed obscene in the silence of the forest. Grace stood frozen, shielding her eyes against the sun reflecting off pristine black paint and chrome. She became acutely aware of how she must look wearing her dead husband's coat over her threadbare clothes, standing on the sagging porch of a cabin that was barely standing, in a yard full of junk she'd been meaning to clear for months but never had the energy or means to move. Doors began to open. Men emerged, dozens of them dressed in black suits that probably cost more than her yearly income. They moved with military precision, spreading out in a coordinated pattern, some speaking into radios, others scanning the tree line with practiced efficiency. These weren't just drivers. They were security, private military, maybe. The kind of protection only the truly wealthy could afford. Grace's breath formed clouds in the freezing air. She wanted to run back inside, to hide, to pretend this wasn't happening, but her legs wouldn't move. Behind her, she heard the cabin door creak open. "Mama?" Maya's voice was barely a whisper. Grace turned to see all 3 children crowding in the doorway, their eyes wide with wonder and confusion. Maya clung to the doorframe, but the boys Ethan and Oliver had gone completely still, their faces transforming as recognition dawned. The lead car's rear door opened. A man stepped out, and even from a distance, Grace could feel the weight of his presence. He was tall, over 6 feet, with silver hair that caught the morning light. His long black coat was elegant and expensive, tailored to perfection, with a cashmere scarf wrapped at his throat. But it was his face that captured Grace's attention. Weathered but distinguished, with sharp features that spoke of both privilege and pain, and his eyes, even from yards away, she could see the desperate hope burning in them. Richard Moretti. Grace had only seen him in pictures on magazine covers at the grocery store checkout line, but there was no mistaking him. He moved with the controlled urgency of a man barely holding himself together, his polished shoes crunching through the snow as he stepped forward. And then, "Daddy!" The word exploded from the cabin behind Grace, Ethan's voice, high and piercing with joy and relief. "Daddy?" Oliver echoed. The boys pushed past Grace, tumbling down the porch steps in their borrowed clothes and mismatched socks. They ran through the snow, stumbling, falling, getting up again, charging toward the man who stood frozen in disbelief. "Ethan? Oliver?" Richard's voice cracked, breaking on their names. His composure shattered completely. He dropped to his knees in the snow, his expensive coat pooling around him, his arms opening wide. The boys crashed into him like small missiles, and he caught them, pulling them against his chest with a desperate strength that spoke of every parent's worst nightmare finally ending. His shoulders shook. Grace could hear his sobs from where she stood, deep, wrenching sounds of relief and anguish and overwhelming gratitude. "My boys," he gasped against their hair. "My boys, my boys, my boys." Ethan was crying. Oliver was crying, their small voices babbling over each other. "We got lost. We were so scared. The car crashed. We walked and walked. We found Miss Grace. She saved us. Daddy, she saved us." Grace stood on her porch, forgotten, watching a reunion she had no part in. Around her, the security team maintained their perimeter, professional and detached, but she could see some of them wiping their eyes, turning away to hide their own emotion at the sight of their employer breaking down in the snow. Maya pressed against Grace's side, slipping her small hand into her mother's. "Mama, is that their daddy?" she whispered. "Yes, baby," Grace managed, her throat tight. "That's their daddy." Richard Moretti held his sons like he would never let them go, rocking them back and forth, his hands frantically checking them over, looking for injuries, for signs of harm. His silver hair was disheveled now, his perfect composure completely abandoned in favor of raw parental love. One of the security men approached him, speaking quietly. Richard nodded without looking up, his attention entirely on his children. The man stepped back and spoke into his radio. Within moments, Grace saw a medical team emerging from one of the vehicles, carrying equipment. The surreal nature of the scene hit her in waves. Less than 12 hours ago, these boys had been dying of cold on her porch. She'd wrapped them in dollar store blankets and fed them powdered eggs. She'd held them through the night with nothing but her body heat and determination keeping them alive. And now they were surrounded by an army of protection, by resources that could have bought her cabin 1,000 times over, by a father whose net worth she couldn't even comprehend. Two worlds colliding in the snow. Richard finally looked up, his eyes red and swollen with tears. His gaze swept the property until it found Grace, still standing on her porch in her dead husband's coat. Their eyes met across the distance, and everything else fell away. She saw the question in his face, the desperate need to understand. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear over the distance and the idling engines. But she understood anyway. "You?" Grace didn't know what to do. Should she wave? Should she speak? Should she go back inside and let these people, these impossibly wealthy, powerful people, handle their business without her? She was suddenly, painfully aware of every inadequacy. Her worn clothes, her unpaid bills, her broken-down life. She was nobody, and she'd saved everything he had. Richard said something to his sons, kissed their foreheads, and then stood. He didn't brush the snow from his coat, didn't straighten his appearance. He simply walked toward her, his stride purposeful despite the grief and relief still etched on his face. The security team moved with him, maintaining formation. But Richard waved them back with a subtle gesture. This was something he needed to do alone. Grace's heart hammered. Maya gripped her hand tighter. Richard Moretti climbed the 3 creaking steps of her porch, and suddenly he was right there, towering over her. Up close, she could see the exhaustion on his face, the lines of sleeplessness and terror that had aged him overnight. His eyes gray-blue like his son's were bloodshot and raw. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The engines idled. The security team waited. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. And then Richard Moretti, one of the most powerful men in America, did something Grace never expected. He took off his expensive leather glove, extended his hand, and his voice rough with emotion, said words that would change everything. "You saved my sons." Grace took his hand. His grip was firm, warm despite the cold, and when their palms met, she felt the tremor running through him, the aftermath of terror finally releasing its hold. "You saved my sons," Richard repeated, his voice breaking. He didn't let go of her hand. "You have no idea what that means." Grace swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how rough her own hands were calloused from work, dry from harsh soap and cold water. She tried to pull away, embarrassed, but Richard held on a moment longer before releasing her. "They were children who needed help," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Any decent person would have done the same. Richard's eyes searched her face, and she saw something flicker there, surprise, perhaps, or disbelief. "You'd be surprised," he said quietly. "How many decent people wouldn't have opened that door?" Behind him, the medical team had surrounded Ethan and Oliver, checking their vital signs with efficient gentleness. The boys kept looking back toward the cabin, toward Grace, as if afraid she might disappear. Will they be okay?" Grace asked, her maternal instinct overriding her discomfort. "Thanks to you," Richard followed her gaze to his sons. The medics say they're stable. Cold exposure, minor frostbite on their fingers and toes, dehydration, but alive. Because of you, he turned back to her, and there were fresh tears in his eyes. Their driver, Marcus, he didn't make it. He stayed with the car, trying to keep the engine running for heat. We found him this morning. Grace's hand went to her mouth. I'm so sorry. So am I. He was a good man. He worked for me for 12 years. Richard's jaw tightened. But he told the boys to go, to find help. And they found you. He paused, seeming to struggle with emotion. May I ask your name? Grace. Grace Johnson. She hesitated, then added, This is my daughter, Maya. Maya had been hiding partially behind her mother, peeking around her coat. At the mention of her name, she stepped forward slightly, her eyes wide as she stared up at the tall, imposing man. Richard's expression softened. He crouched down, bringing himself to Maya's level despite the snow soaking through his expensive pants. Hello, Maya. Did you help take care of my boys? Maya nodded shyly. I gave them my bear to hold, and I shared my blankets. That was very kind of you. Richard's voice was gentle. Thank you for sharing with them. He stood slowly, wincing slightly, the movement of a man who'd spent the entire night searching in brutal conditions. Grace noticed the exhaustion in every line of his body, the way he held himself through sheer force of will. One of the security guards approached, speaking in a low voice. Sir, we need to get the children to the hospital. The helicopter's waiting. Richard nodded but didn't move. He seemed rooted to the spot, unable to leave. Finally, he reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet. Miss Johnson, Grace, please. Let me give you something. A reward. You saved my children's lives. He extracted what looked like a check, already filled out. Grace couldn't see the amount, but from the way he held it casually, as if it were nothing, she knew it had to be substantial. I can't accept that, Grace said, taking a step back. Richard's brow furrowed. I'm sorry. I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly. Grace's voice was quiet but firm. You want to thank me, and I appreciate that, but I can't take money for doing what was right. Grace, this is... He glanced at the check. This is $50,000. Do you understand? I understand what money is, Mr. Moretti. Something in Grace's tone made him stop. I understand better than you might think, but if I took money for helping your sons, what would I be teaching my daughter? Richard stared at her, the check still extended in his hand. What do you mean? Grace looked down at Maya, then back at Richard. My daughter watched me open that door last night. She watched me give away the last of our food, our blankets, our warmth. Not because I expected something in return, but because it was the right thing to do. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. If I take money for that now? I'm teaching her that kindness is a transaction, that you only help people if there's something in it for you. But you need, Richard gestured at the cabin, at her worn coat, at the obvious poverty surrounding them. You clearly need help. Need and deserve are different things, Mr. Moretti. Grace's chin lifted slightly. I need a lot of things, but I don't deserve payment for being human. The words hung in the cold air between them. Around them, the security team had gone silent, listening. Even the medics working with the boys had paused, watching this impossible conversation between a billionaire and a woman who had nothing. Richard slowly lowered the check. He stared at Grace with an expression she couldn't quite read, confusion mixed with something that looked like awe. You're teaching her something most of us forgot, he said finally, his voice rough. Something I forgot. He folded the check carefully and put it back in his wallet. When he looked at Grace again, there was a new respect in his eyes. My wife, his voice caught. My wife died 2 years ago. Cancer. She used to say that money makes you comfortable, but it doesn't make you good. I didn't understand what she meant until just now. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. I lost my husband too. 2 years ago. Construction accident. Then you understand, Richard said softly. What it means to raise children alone. To do everything yourself because there's no other choice. Yes, Grace whispered. I understand. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two parents who'd both known loss, both known love, both known the fierce desperation to keep their children safe. The vast difference in their circumstances seemed to shrink, if only for a heartbeat. Sir, the security guard was back, more insistent this time. We really need to go. Richard nodded. He extended his hand again, and Grace took it. This time, there was no tremor. Just warmth and gratitude, and something that felt almost like friendship. Thank you, Grace Johnson. he said clearly, his voice carrying across the snow. "Not just from me, but from everyone who loves those boys. You saved the most precious things in my life, and I will never forget it." He turned to address his security team, raising his voice so they all could hear. "This woman, Grace Johnson, is a hero. She opened her door in the middle of a blizzard and saved my sons when they had nowhere else to turn. She gave them her last food, her warmth, her protection, and asked for nothing in return." He looked back at Grace. "She reminded me what it means to be human." Several of the security guards nodded. Some touched their hands to their hearts in respect. Grace felt her face flush with embarrassment, and something else, pride, maybe, or validation. After so many months of being invisible, of being dismissed and overlooked, she was being seen. Richard walked back toward his sons, but paused and turned back. "Grace, may I ask one thing?" "Of course." The boys said you told them a story, about stars being angels who light the way home. Grace nodded, surprised he knew. "My wife used to tell them that same story," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "She said her grandmother taught it to her. I haven't heard it since she died." He paused, composing himself. "Thank you for reminding them, for keeping her alive for them, even though you didn't know." Before Grace could respond, Ethan and Oliver broke free from the medics and ran back to her. They wrapped their arms around her waist, squeezing tight. "Thank you, Miss Grace," Ethan said. "We'll never forget you," Oliver added. Grace knelt down, gathering them close one last time. "You boys be good for your daddy, okay? And remember you were so brave. I'm proud of you." The boys nodded, tears streaming down their faces. Then Richard was there, gently guiding them back toward the cars. They climbed into the lead vehicle, their faces pressed against the window, watching Grace as if memorizing her. Maya waved at them, and they waved back. The engines began to rev. The procession prepared to leave the way it had come, a river of wealth and power flowing back to a world Grace would never be part of. Richard stood by his car door, looking back at her one last time. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The gratitude, the respect, the acknowledgement of what she'd done, it was all there in his eyes. Then he climbed in, the door closed, and slowly, the convoy began to move. Grace and Maya stood on the porch, watching 50 Rolls-Royces disappear back into the forest. The sound of engines faded gradually, swallowed by the silence of snow and trees, and then they were gone. The driveway was empty except for tire tracks in the snow. The forest returned to its cathedral quiet. The sun climbed higher, warming the frozen world by slow degrees. Maya tugged on Grace's coat. "Mama, are they coming back?" Grace looked down at her daughter, then back at the empty road. "No, baby," she said softly. "They're going home. Will we see them again?" "I don't think so." Maya was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad we helped them." Grace pulled her daughter close, feeling the weight of exhaustion finally settling over her. "Me too, baby. Me too." They went back inside. The cabin felt emptier now, colder. Grace looked at the blankets, still piled by the fire, at the empty soup can in the sink, at the evidence of a night that had felt like a dream. But it had been real. All of it. She had saved 2 lives. She had met a billionaire. She had been offered more money than she'd ever seen, and she had said no. Grace smiled despite her exhaustion, despite her hunger, despite the impossible weight of her circumstances. Because her mother had been right. Kindness was never wasted, even if that's all you had to give. The silence after the engines faded was profound, almost oppressive. Grace stood on the porch long after the last Rolls-Royce disappeared around the bend, staring at the tire tracks carved into the snow. They looked like evidence of something impossible, proof that the morning had actually happened, that she hadn't imagined the entire surreal encounter. Maya tugged at her hand. "Mama, I'm cold." Grace blinked, pulled from her reverie. "Of course, baby. Let's go inside." The cabin felt different when they stepped back through the door. Smaller somehow, as if the walls had closed in during their absence. Or perhaps it had always been this small, and she was only now seeing it through the eyes of people who lived in a different world entirely. She imagined what Richard Moretti must have thought when he'd glanced at her home, the sagging porch, the patched walls, the broken window she'd covered with cardboard and duct tape, the poverty that clung to every surface like frost. Grace shook her head, trying to dispel the thought. It didn't matter what he thought. The boys were safe, that's what mattered. But still, the cabin felt emptier now. She moved through the small space mechanically, straightening blankets, washing the few dishes they'd used for breakfast. Her hands worked while her mind wandered, replaying the morning in fragments. Richard's tears, the security team, the offer of money she'd refused. Had she been a fool? $50,000. That money could have changed everything, paid off her debts, fixed the cabin, bought food and clothes and medicine. But at what cost? She could still hear her own words. If I took money for doing what's right, what would I be teaching my daughter? Grace glanced at Maya, who had settled on the floor with her coloring books, humming softly to herself. No, she'd made the right choice. Maya had watched her mother act with integrity, had seen that kindness wasn't something you did for reward but something you did because you were human. That lesson was worth more than any check, even if it meant they'd still go hungry. As Grace folded the blankets the boys had used, something small and soft fell to the floor. She bent down and picked it up, a child's mitten, dark blue with red stripes. Oliver's. She remembered seeing them last night when she'd peeled off his frozen clothes. He must have left it behind in the chaos of the reunion. Grace held the mitten in her palm, feeling its weight. Such a small thing. Probably expensive cashmere, maybe, or some blend she'd never heard of. She lifted it to her face and caught the faint scent of expensive detergent and something else. The clean, innocent smell of childhood. She folded it carefully and placed it on the windowsill, next to its mate that she found tucked between the couch cushions. 2 forgotten mittens. Evidence that Ethan and Oliver Moretti had been here, had been real. Maya looked up from her coloring. Mama, look what I made. Grace walked over and knelt beside her daughter. The drawing was done in crayon on the back of an old envelope, the only paper they had. Maya had drawn their cabin, recognizable by its pitched roof and the single window. In front of it, she'd drawn stick figures, 2 tall ones and 3 small ones. The taller figures wore crowns. That's you and me, Maya explained, pointing to 2 of the small figures. And that's Ethan and Oliver. And that's their daddy who came to get them. She'd drawn a large figure with silver hair, or what passed for silver in her gray crayon. I made him a king, because he had all those fancy cars. It's beautiful, baby, Grace said softly. Can I keep it, to remember them? Of course. Grace's throat tightened. We'll remember them always. She propped the drawing up on the kitchen counter, leaning it against the chipped ceramic sugar jar that hadn't held sugar in weeks. Miss Grace's house, drawn by a 6-year-old who didn't understand yet how much that house was failing them. The afternoon stretched out, long and quiet. Grace tried to keep busy, but there was only so much to do in a cabin this small. She checked their food supply again, though she already knew what she'd find: almost nothing. The boys' brief stay had depleted what little she had. A handful of rice, some dried beans that would take hours to cook, no meat, no eggs, no milk. She'd have to walk to town tomorrow, assuming the roads were clear enough. Maybe Frank at the diner would feel guilty enough about firing her to give her a few days' work. Or maybe she could clean houses again, though last time she'd tried, the women had clutched their purses tighter when they saw her, as if poverty were contagious. Grace pushed the worry down. She'd managed before. She'd manage again. Mama? Maya's voice was small. Are we going to be okay? Grace turned to find her daughter watching her with worried eyes, eyes that saw too much, understood too much for someone so young. Yes, baby, Grace said, pulling Maya into her lap. We're going to be fine, but we don't have much food left. I know, but we've been through tight spots before, haven't we? And we always find a way. Maya nodded against her chest, but Grace could feel the doubt in her small body. Children knew when their parents were scared, no matter how hard you tried to hide it. That evening, as the sun began to set, Grace made a thin soup with the rice and some dried herbs. It wasn't much, but it was warm. They ate in silence, sitting on the floor by the fire. The wood was running low again. Grace would have to brave the cold tomorrow, dig through the snow to reach the woodpile in the back. After dinner, she tucked Maya into her makeshift bed on the couch, piling on every blanket they owned. The cabin had grown cold again with the fire dying down, and Grace could see her breath in the air beyond the circle of warmth. Tell me the angel story, Maya asked, her voice drowsy. Grace smiled and stroked her daughter's hair. A long, long time ago, the angels looked down from heaven and saw how dark the world was at night. She recited the story her mother had taught her, the same one she'd told the Moretti boys just last night. Maya's eyes drifted closed before she reached the end, her breathing evening out into sleep. Grace sat beside her daughter for a long time, watching her chest rise and fall, memorizing the peaceful expression on her face. She thought about Ethan and Oliver, probably sleeping now in beds with silk sheets, in rooms larger than her entire cabin, surrounded by everything money could buy. She wondered if they were thinking about her too, if they'd remember the woman who'd taken them in, or if the memory would fade, replaced by the comfortable life they'd returned to. She wondered if Richard Moretti would think of her tomorrow, or next week, or ever again. Probably not. Rich people had short memories for the help they received from people like her. Grace rose quietly and walked to the window. Outside, the world was transforming. The clouds that had hung low for days were finally breaking apart, and through the gaps, she could see the first stars emerging. The sun was setting in the west, painting the snow-covered hills in shades of gold and pink. It was the first sunset she'd seen clearly in nearly a week. Grace pressed her forehead against the cold glass and closed her eyes. She didn't know if anyone was listening, but she prayed anyway, whispered the words into the gathering darkness. Lord, let them be safe. Ethan and Oliver, keep them warm and healthy and loved. Help their father heal from his grief. And Lord, if you're listening, if you care about people like me, please help us too. I don't know how much longer I can do this alone. I'm trying to be strong, trying to have faith like Mama taught me, but I'm so tired. So tired. Her voice broke. She pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle a sob, not wanting to wake Maya. Just keep my baby safe, she finished in a whisper. That's all I ask. Keep my baby safe. The prayer hung in the silence, unanswered. But somehow, Grace felt lighter for having spoken it. She opened her eyes and looked out at the sunset one more time. The first sun in days glowed across the white hills, turning the world into something beautiful. The storm had passed. The roads would clear. Life would go on, the way it always did, one difficult day at a time. Grace glanced back at the mittens on the windowsill, two small pieces of a world she'd briefly touched but would never be part of. She thought about the choices she'd made, the money she'd refused, the dignity she'd held onto when it would have been so easy to let it go. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. What you give comes back, child. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it comes back. Grace didn't believe it. She couldn't afford to believe in fairy tales anymore, but she wanted to. God, how she wanted to. Outside, the sun sank below the horizon, and the stars began to emerge one by one, angels lighting the way home for lost travelers. Grace watched them appear, these distant lights in the darkness, and allowed herself one small moment of hope. Maybe tomorrow would be better. Maybe kindness wasn't wasted after all. Maybe, just maybe, opening that door had meant something more than she could see yet. The night settled over Montana, quiet and cold and full of stars, and in a forgotten cabin at the edge of the forest, a woman who had nothing held on to everything that mattered. Her daughter, her integrity, and a hope she was almost afraid to name. Tomorrow, she'd have to figure out how to survive. But tonight, she'd done something extraordinary. And for now, that was enough. 3 weeks passed, like water through cupped hands each day, the same struggle, the same exhaustion, the same quiet desperation. Grace had gotten her job back at the diner. Frank hadn't apologized for firing her, but he'd muttered something about being short-staffed and told her she could work the breakfast shift if she wanted. The pay was still terrible, the hours brutal, but it was something. Maya went to school with a lunch that was mostly carrot sticks and crackers, and Grace pretended not to notice the hunger in her daughter's eyes. The cabin had grown colder. Grace rationed the firewood like a miser, burning only enough to keep the pipes from freezing. They slept in the same bed now, sharing body heat under every blanket they owned. Some nights, Grace lay awake listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the walls and wondered how much longer they could survive like this. The mittens still sat on the windowsill, gathering dust. Grace looked at them sometimes and wondered if the whole thing had been a dream. Rich people didn't appear in processions of luxury cars. Billionaires didn't kneel in the snow and cry. Maybe she'd imagined it all a fever dream brought on by cold and hunger and loneliness. But the mittens were real. And so was the memory. On a Tuesday afternoon in late February, Grace finished her shift at the diner and caught a ride back toward her cabin with old Mr. Henderson, who delivered propane to the scattered homes in the hills. He dropped her off at the bottom of her road, and she began the long walk up, her feet aching in boots that had worn through at the sole. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Grace pulled her coat tighter and focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Another day survived, another small victory against the weight of the world. She was halfway up the drive when she heard it, the sound of engines, of voices, of activity. Her heart lurched. For one confused moment, she thought the Morettis had returned. But as she crested the hill and her cabin came into view, she stopped dead in her tracks. Trucks, multiple trucks, including a semi-trailer, were parked around her property. Men in work clothes and hard hats moved with purpose, carrying lumber and equipment. A crane was positioned near the cabin, and she could hear the whine of power tools, the shouts of workers coordinating. Fear shot through her like ice water. They were taking her cabin. She'd missed a payment somewhere, or the county had finally decided to condemn it, or the bank had. Grace broke into a run, her exhaustion forgotten. Wait. Stop. What are you doing? This is my property. A man in a yellow hard hat turned at her voice. He was older, weathered, with kind eyes and a clipboard. The foreman. Ma'am, are you Grace Johnson? Yes. What's going on? You can't just… Miss Johnson. He held up a hand, his voice calm. Please, it's all right. We're not here to take anything. We're here to help. Grace's chest heaved. Help? I don't understand. I didn't call anyone. I can't afford. The foreman reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Official looking, cream-colored, expensive. We're here on behalf of a private donor. He insists it's a gift from a friend. Grace took the envelope with shaking hands. She stared at it, unable to process what he was saying. A gift? From who? The donor wishes to remain anonymous, the foreman said, but there was a small smile on his face, like he knew she'd figure it out. But he's paid for a complete renovation of your property. New foundation, insulation, electrical wiring, plumbing, heating system, solar panels, the works. We're basically rebuilding your cabin from the ground up, keeping the structure, but making it safe and livable. Grace's legs went weak. She looked past him at the controlled chaos of the worksite. Men were carrying sheets of insulation. A truck was being unloaded with what looked like a brand new stove. Another group was working on the roof, replacing the rotting shingles. There must be some mistake, she whispered. No mistake. We've got your name right here, and the deed matches this property. He gestured toward the cabin. We've been working for about a week now, interior work mostly. Wanted to surprise you with it closer to completion, but we needed to bring in the big equipment today. A week? Grace's mind reeled. But I've been here every night. We worked during the day while you were at work. Your neighbor, Mr. Henderson, let us know your schedule. The foreman's expression softened. Ma'am, whoever this donor is, he cares a great deal about making sure you're taken care of. Every detail has been covered. He even arranged for a full pantry installation. They delivered the food this morning, enough to last you months. Grace's vision blurred. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers and pulled out a letter. The paper was thick, expensive, with a watermark she couldn't quite make out in the fading light. The handwriting was elegant, masculine, written in real ink. Dear Grace, I know you refused my money, and I respect that decision more than I can express. But please understand what you did for my sons cannot go unanswered. Not because kindness requires payment, but because those of us who have been given much have a responsibility to do better. You saved my boys' lives. You gave them warmth, food, safety, and hope when they had none. You asked for nothing in return. In doing so, you reminded me of something my late wife always said, that the measure of a person isn't in what they have, but in what they give when they have nothing left to give. This is not payment. This is not charity. This is simply one parent helping another, because I understand now what it means to struggle alone, to choose between heat and food, to lie awake wondering how you'll keep your child safe. I cannot undo your hardships, but I can ensure you have a warm, safe place to raise your daughter. Please accept this gift not for yourself, but for Maya. Every child deserves to be warm at night. Your kindness saved more than 2 lives that night. It saved a father's soul. With eternal gratitude, Air Moretti. P.S. The boys wanted me to tell you they think about you every day. Ethan says the stars still remind him of you. Grace's hands shook so badly the letter fluttered like a leaf. Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot against her cold skin. She pressed the letter to her chest and looked up at the cabin, her cabin being transformed before her eyes. Miss Johnson? The foreman's voice was gentle. Would you like to see inside? We've made significant progress. Grace could only nod. He led her toward the cabin, and workers stepped aside respectfully as she passed. Some of them nodded. A few smiled. They knew. They understood the gift they were giving. The foreman opened the door, and Grace stepped inside. She didn't recognize it. Where there had been sagging floorboards, there was now solid, level wood, real hardwood, honey-colored and smooth. The walls had been reinforced and insulated, then covered with fresh drywall and painted a soft, warm cream. New windows actual, functional windows let in the fading sunlight, and in the corner where her ancient, dangerous wood stove had been, there now stood a beautiful cast-iron hearth with a stone surround, already radiating gentle heat. But it was the kitchen that made her knees buckle. Where her 2-burner hot plate had been, there was now a proper stove, gas-powered, connected to a large propane tank she could see through the window. The cabinets had been replaced, and when the foreman opened them, Grace saw they were fully stocked. Canned goods, dry goods, pasta, rice, beans, coffee, tea, spices, dozens and dozens of items, organized and plentiful. A new refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner, full-sized, modern, and when she opened it with shaking hands, she found it stocked with milk, cheese, eggs, fresh vegetables, and meat. "There's more," the foreman said quietly. He walked to a small room that had once been a closet. "We turned this into a proper bathroom, running water, hot water heater, shower, the whole works. The tank's filled, and with the solar panels on the roof, you'll have electricity and hot water year-round. No bills." Grace turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. This wasn't her cabin anymore. It was a home, a real home, warm and safe and solid. "There's one more thing." The foreman handed her another envelope, this one official-looking with a legal seal. "This was in your mailbox." Grace opened it with numb fingers. Inside was a property deed, legal and binding. Her name was listed as the owner of not just the cabin, but 10 acres of forest land surrounding it. Land she'd never owned, that had always belonged to some distant bank or corporation. Now it was hers. All of it. "It's paid in full," the foreman explained. "Taxes covered for the next 10 years. It's yours, Miss Johnson. Truly yours." Grace sank down onto the new floor, her back against the wall, the letter and the deed clutched in her hands. Great, heaving sobs tore through her, months of held-back fear and pain and exhaustion finally breaking free. She cried like she hadn't cried since Daniel died, her whole body shaking with the force of it. The foreman quietly excused himself, closing the door to give her privacy. Grace didn't know how long she sat there, crying in the warm cabin that had been remade around her. The new hearth crackled softly, filling the space with gentle heat. Through the new windows, she could see the workers continuing their tasks, putting finishing touches on the exterior. Eventually, her tears slowed. She wiped her face with her sleeve and looked around again, seeing every detail with fresh eyes. The care that had gone into this, the thoughtfulness. Richard Moretti hadn't just thrown money at her problem, he'd understood what she needed. Dignity, security, a chance. Grace pulled herself to her feet and walked to the hearth. She sat down on the warm stone surround and held her hands out to the fire, feeling the heat sink into her cold bones. "Your kindness saved more than 2 lives that night," the letter had said. "It saved a father's soul." Grace thought about that night 3 weeks ago. The knock on the door, the choice she'd made to open it despite her fear, the boys sleeping by her fire, and the billionaire kneeling in the snow. She'd thought the story ended when the convoy drove away, but maybe it was only just beginning. Outside, the sun set fully, and the first stars appeared. Grace looked up through her new window and found the brightest one, the way she'd taught the boys. "Thank you," she whispered to the star, to Richard, to God, to whoever was listening. "Thank you." The invitation arrived on a Tuesday in late May, delivered by a courier who seemed surprised to find the address he was looking for actually existed. Grace signed for it with hands still rough from morning dishwashing, though her home was warm now, and her daughter no longer went to bed hungry. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with her name written in elegant calligraphy. Inside, embossed on heavy cardstock with gold lettering, "You are cordially invited to the Johnson Initiative Charity Gala, benefiting emergency winter shelters for families in crisis. The Plaza Hotel, New York City. Black tie, optional." Grace read it 3 times, certain she was misunderstanding. A charity gala, in New York City, with her name on it. There was a handwritten note attached. "Grace, please say yes. The boys have been practicing their speeches for weeks, and they'll be devastated if you're not there to hear them. We're sending a car and covering all expenses, no arguments this time. This foundation exists because of you. You should be there when we launch it. Please come. Richard." Grace sat down heavily at her kitchen table, the new one that didn't wobble, and stared at the invitation. A charity named after her. The Johnson Initiative. She didn't even know what to feel. Pride? Embarrassment? Disbelief? Maya came running in from the yard, her cheeks flushed from playing. "Mama, what's that?" "An invitation," Grace said slowly. "To New York City." Maya's eyes went wide. "Like in the movies? With the tall buildings?" "Yes, baby. Just like in the movies." "Are we going?" Grace looked at her daughter's excited face and felt her resistance crumbling. How could she say no to this? Not for herself, but for Maya, who deserved to see that kindness had consequences, that doing the right thing mattered, that the world could be good sometimes. "Yes," Grace heard herself say. "I think we are." 3 months later, Grace stood in front of the mirror in a New York hotel room and barely recognized herself. The dress had been sent ahead dark blue silk that draped elegantly without being ostentatious. Simple but beautiful. Someone had guessed her size perfectly. There were shoes, too, and a small clutch purse. Even a necklace, nothing flashy, just a simple silver pendant. Grace touched the fabric, marveling at how it felt against her skin. She'd never worn anything this fine in her life. Maya twirled in her own dress, a soft pink with small flowers embroidered at the hem. A woman from the hotel had come to fix their hair and makeup, treating them like they mattered, like they belonged here. Maya couldn't stop looking at herself in the mirror, her curls pinned back with pearl clips. "Mama, you look like a princess," Maya breathed. "So do you, baby." Grace's voice caught. She thought of all the nights they'd shivered together in the old cabin, all the meals stretched too thin, all the times she'd wondered if she was failing her daughter. And now this a moment of pure magic, unearned but somehow given anyway. A knock at the door. A hotel attendant informed them the car was ready. The ride to the Plaza Hotel felt like a dream. Grace pressed her face to the window like a child, watching the lights of Manhattan blur past. Maya sat beside her, gripping her hand, too excited to speak. When they arrived, Grace nearly lost her nerve. The entrance was lit up like a palace, with photographers and guests in gowns and tuxedos ascending the red-carpeted steps. This wasn't her world. She didn't belong here. But then she saw them. At the top of the steps, waiting. Ethan and Oliver, dressed in matching dark suits, their faces breaking into enormous smiles the moment they spotted her. "Miss Grace!" They ran down the steps, and Grace knelt just in time to catch them both in a fierce hug. "Look at you two," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "So grown up." "We missed you," Ethan said. "We wanted to call, but Dad said we should wait for the gala to surprise you," Oliver added. "Well, I'm surprised," Grace laughed through tears. "And so happy to see you." Richard appeared behind his sons, elegant in a tuxedo, his silver hair gleaming. He looked more rested than he had that terrible morning in the snow, but his eyes still held the same warmth, the same gratitude. "Grace." He extended his hand, then seemed to think better of it, and pulled her into a brief, respectful hug. "Thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy." "It's terrifying," Grace admitted. "You'll be brilliant," Richard said with confidence. "Come, I want you to see what you've helped create." He led them inside, and Grace entered a world of crystal chandeliers and marble floors, of champagne glasses catching light and beautiful people laughing in clusters. She felt Maya shrink against her side, overwhelmed. Grace squeezed her daughter's hand reassuringly. The ballroom was breathtaking. Round tables draped in white linen, each centerpiece a small forest of flowers. A stage at the front with a screen behind it. And along the walls, poster displays showing images of families, real families, weathered and struggling alongside statistics about winter homelessness and emergency shelter needs. Richard guided her to a table near the front, where place cards had their names written in calligraphy. Grace Johnson, Maya Johnson. They sat, and servers immediately appeared with water, with juice for Maya, with reassurances that everything would be explained. The room gradually filled. Hundreds of people, wealthy donors, celebrities, politicians, business leaders, all here for a charity that bore her name. It was incomprehensible. As dinner was served, Richard leaned over. "Are you ready? You'll be called up after the boys and I speak." Grace's heart jumped into her throat. "Called up? I thought I was just attending." "Grace, you're the guest of honor. I should have been clearer in the invitation." He looked apologetic. "You don't have to say much. Just let people see you. Let them understand that real heroism looks like." Before Grace could protest, the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the room. Richard stood and walked to the stage, and a spotlight followed him. "Good evening," his voice carried easily, amplified by microphones. "Thank you all for being here tonight. We gather to launch the Johnson Initiative, a foundation dedicated to providing emergency shelter and support for families caught in crisis during winter months." The screen behind him lit up with images of the cabin before and after. Grace's breath caught. There was her old, broken-down home, and then the transformation. The audience murmured appreciatively. "6 months ago," Richard continued, his voice growing thick with emotion. "My sons were lost in a blizzard. Their driver had died. They were freezing, terrified, and alone. By a miracle, they found a cabin with a light in the window, and the woman who lived there, despite having almost nothing herself, opened her door." The screen changed to show a photograph. Grace gasped. It was her cabin on that night, taken from outside. Someone must have photographed it later, recreating the scene. Snow piled high, a single warm light in the window, a beacon in the darkness. Grace Johnson gave my sons her last food, her warmth, her protection. She stayed awake all night to keep them safe. And when I tried to thank her with money, she refused. Richard's voice broke slightly. She said she couldn't accept payment for doing what was right, because what would that teach her daughter? The audience was silent, captivated. That moment changed me, Richard said quietly. It reminded me that wealth means nothing if we don't use it to help others. So I'm honored to announce the Johnson Initiative, a network of emergency shelters across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, where families can find safety during winter storms. We'll provide heat, food, supplies, and support, asking nothing in return. Because that's what Grace taught me. Kindness without conditions. He turned toward her table. Grace Johnson, would you please join me on stage? Every head in the room turned. Grace felt frozen, but Maya whispered, "Go, Mama. I'm proud of you." On shaking legs, Grace stood. The room erupted in applause, thunderous, overwhelming. She walked to the stage, her heart pounding so hard she thought she might faint. Richard took her hand and helped her up the steps. Ethan and Oliver were there too, running to hug her again. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard said, his arm gently guiding Grace to center stage. "Grace Johnson. The reason this foundation exists." The applause intensified. People stood a standing ovation that went on and on. Grace stood there, overwhelmed, tears streaming down her face. She saw Maya at their table, clapping enthusiastically, her face shining with pride. A reporter in the front called out, "Mr. Moretti, why name a charity after a woman from Montana? Why not your family name?" Richard's answer was immediate and clear. "Because when my wealth failed, her humanity didn't." The words hung in the air. Perfect, true, undeniable. Grace Johnson represents everything this foundation stands for, Richard continued. She didn't help my sons because she expected reward. She helped them because it was right. That's the spirit we want to embody, unconditional kindness in times of crisis. He turned to Grace, speaking directly to her now, though his microphone carried the words to everyone. "You asked for nothing, but please accept this. The knowledge that because of your example, hundreds of families will find shelter. Because of your kindness, others will learn to be kind. You saved more than my sons that night, Grace. You saved my faith in humanity." Grace couldn't speak. Her throat was too tight, her emotions too overwhelming. She could only nod, tears flowing freely. Ethan stepped forward to the microphone, his young voice clear and earnest. "Miss Grace told us a story about angels becoming stars to light the way home. She was our star that night." Oliver added, "We'll never forget you. And now other kids won't have to be as scared as we were, because of you." The applause swelled again. Grace looked out at the sea of faces, strangers, all of them, but looking at her with respect, with admiration, with recognition. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, desperate and forgotten and alone. She was still that woman. But now the world could see what she'd always known, that being poor didn't mean being worthless, that having nothing didn't mean you had nothing to give. Richard placed a glass plaque in her hands, engraved simply, "Grace Johnson, founder of kindness." "Thank you," Grace finally managed to whisper into the microphone. "Thank you for seeing that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, for remembering that the smallest light matters most in the darkest night." It was all she could manage, but it was enough. The crowd rose again, applauding not just her, but the idea of her, the possibility that goodness still existed, that kindness still mattered, that one person's choice to open a door could change everything. Grace looked down at Maya, who was crying and clapping and glowing with pride, and Grace understood, finally, what her mother had meant all those years ago. Kindness was never wasted. It just sometimes took a while to bloom. The first snow of the season fell on a November morning, soft and silent, blanketing the Montana hills in fresh white. Grace stood at her window, new glass, properly sealed, keeping out the cold, and watched the flakes drift down like the stars she'd once told the boys about. Angels returning to earth, her mother would have said. She still lived in the cabin, though it was unrecognizable from the structure it had been a year ago. Warm now, solid, safe. But more than that, it had become something bigger than herself. The local branch of the Johnson Initiative operated from an addition built onto the side of her home. A small office with a phone line that never stopped ringing, a radio for emergency broadcasts, and a stockpile of supplies ready for families in crisis. Grace Johnson, who had once been invisible, was now the person people called when they had nowhere else to turn. She managed it all, coordinating with other shelters across the state, arranging supply deliveries, taking calls at 3 a.m. from terrified parents stranded in storms. Richard had offered her a salary that had made her dizzy, but she'd negotiated it down to something that felt fair, something she could accept without losing herself. Enough to live comfortably, to give Maya the life she deserved, but not so much that she forgot what struggle felt like, because she never wanted to forget. Maya was at school now, a good school, warm and safe, with teachers who saw her potential. She had friends, a closet with clothes that fit, a lunchbox that was always full, but Grace made sure her daughter still understood the value of what they'd been given. They volunteered at the shelter every weekend. They donated what they didn't need. They never passed someone in need without stopping to help. What you give comes back, child, but you keep giving anyway. The mittens still sat on the windowsill where Grace had placed them that first morning. Dark blue with red stripes, impossibly small, a physical reminder that the night had been real. She'd kept them there through the renovation, through all the changes, refusing to put them away. They were her talisman, her proof that one choice, one moment of compassion could ripple outward in ways she'd never imagined. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Grace thought about the woman she'd been that night. Desperate, hungry, afraid, with every reason to keep her door closed and her last resources protected. What if she'd made a different choice? What if fear had won? But it hadn't, and that made all the difference. The phone on her desk rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She answered on the second ring. Johnson Initiative, this is Grace. Grace, it's Tom Henderson from Route 12. Got a family here. Car broke down in the snow. 3 kids, no winter coats. Can you? I'll be there in 20 minutes, Grace said, already reaching for her keys. Keep them warm. I'm bringing supplies. This was her life now. Not glamorous, not easy, but purposeful. Every family she helped, every child she wrapped in a warm blanket, every parent she looked in the eye and said, "You're not alone." It all mattered. It all meant something. She was pulling on her coat when she heard the sound of a vehicle coming up her drive. Grace glanced out the window, puzzled. She wasn't expecting anyone. A delivery van, plain and unmarked, pulled to a stop in front of her cabin. The driver emerged with a small package, checking his clipboard. Grace opened the door as he approached. "Grace Johnson? That's me. Special delivery. Sign here, please." She signed, took the package surprisingly light, wrapped in brown paper, and the driver tipped his hat and drove away. Grace carried it inside, setting it on her kitchen table. No return address, just her name written in familiar, careful handwriting. Children's handwriting. She opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a small jewelry box. Grace lifted the lid with trembling fingers. A silver snowflake pendant lay against black velvet, delicate and beautiful. Each crystalline point was detailed with tiny diamonds that caught the light. It was the kind of jewelry she'd never have bought for herself, too expensive, too fine. But it was also simple enough that she could wear it every day. Underneath the box, a note card with 2 sets of handwriting. "Dear Miss Grace, Dad says you're helping lots of families now, just like you helped us. We're so proud of you. We wanted to send something to remind you that you're special. Thank you for saving us. Thank you for the story about the stars. We look for them every night and think of you. Love, Ethan and Oliver. P.S. Dad says to tell you he's proud too, and that Mom would have loved you." Grace pressed the note to her chest, her vision blurring with tears. After all this time, they still remembered, still thought of her. The weight of that love unearned, freely given, settled over her shoulders like a blanket. She fastened the pendant around her neck, feeling the cool silver rest against her heart. Then she walked back to the window, looking out at the snow that continued to fall. The world outside was white and cold and beautiful. Somewhere out there, families were struggling, children were afraid, parents were wondering how they'd make it through another winter. But they'd make it. Because doors would open, because people would help, because kindness, like snow, accumulated one small act at a time until it transformed the landscape. Grace touched the snowflake at her throat, then the mittens on the windowsill. She thought about the night that had changed everything, the knock that had terrified her, the choice that had saved her. Not just the boys, herself. Because in opening that door, Grace had discovered something she'd forgotten in her years of struggle, that she still had something to give, that poverty hadn't taken her humanity. That being broken didn't mean being worthless. She'd opened her door not knowing who stood on the other side, not knowing if she had enough to share, not knowing that her small act of kindness would ripple outward, touching hundreds of lives, creating a foundation built on the simple premise that people mattered. All people, rich or poor, lost or found, desperate or secure. Everyone deserved warmth. Everyone deserved a light in the darkness. Maya would be home from school soon, and they'd make hot chocolate together in their warm kitchen. Tonight, they'd call the Moretti boys like they did every month. And Ethan and Oliver would tell them about school and friends and the foundation's latest success. Richard would get on the line and update her on the new shelters being built, on the families being helped, on the ripple effect of one woman's choice. But for now, Grace stood at her window and watched the snow fall, feeling the weight of the pendant against her heart and the warmth of the cabin around her. She thought about all the people who had told her she was nothing, all the doors that had closed in her face, all the times she'd been overlooked, dismissed, forgotten. They'd been wrong. She'd always been someone. She just needed the chance to prove it not to them, but to herself. The snow fell harder now, covering the roads, making the world dangerous for travelers. Soon, the phone would ring. Someone would need help. And Grace would answer. Because that's what she did now. That's who she'd always been, even when the world couldn't see it. She didn't open her door that night to save a billionaire's sons. She didn't open it expecting reward or recognition. She didn't even open it certain she had enough to share. She opened it because a child was crying in the cold. She opened it because someone needed help, and she could give it. She opened it because that's what love does when the world turns cold. And in that single choice, that one moment of compassion over fear, of humanity over self-preservation, she'd saved more than 2 freezing boys. She'd saved herself. She'd saved a father's shattered heart. She'd sparked a movement that would warm countless families for generations to come. All because she opened her door. Grace smiled, touching the snowflake pendant one more time. Then she turned from the window, put on her warmest coat, and grabbed the emergency supplies she'd packed that morning. Somewhere out there, the Henderson family was waiting, and Grace Johnson was on her way. The door was always open, and the light was always on. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the largest ripples. Sometimes the poorest among us are the richest in spirit. And sometimes, a single choice to love when the world turns cold can change everything. For every Grace Johnson who opens her door despite fear, for every child who finds warmth in the darkness, for every parent who gives when they have nothing left, this story is for you. You are seen, you are valued, you matter. Keep the light on. So what do you think? Would you have opened that door? Let me know in the comments. And if Grace's courage inspired you, smash that like button and subscribe, because every day I bring you real stories of real people who prove that humanity is worth believing in. The next video is already queued up on your screen. Click it now, because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. See you in the next one.